Hello everyone, it's New York Railfan 202 here, and we're going to be continuing Engines of Metro North, this time by talking about the Budd Rail Diesel Car, or RDC. Now let's get started on the lengthy and important history of this vehicle. In 1912, Edward G. Budd created a company to manufacture all-steel car bodies for automotive manufacturers. Budd pioneered the shot welding technique, used to combine pieces of steel together more efficiently than other methods. This technique saved on weight and also cost over other methods. The flexibility of this technique allowed Budd to pioneer more creative shapes and lead them to be a pioneer in auto body construction, mostly with the Dodge brothers and their cars. With the automobile industry growing in the US, Budd saw a lot of success in their creation of lightweight car bodies, but at the time, the passenger rail industry was still approaching its peak. At the time, streamlining was all the rage with automobiles, and Budd's method of construction was perfect for this design of car body. Streamliner designs were also prevalent in the railroad industry as well, which is why in 1934, Budd built the infamous Pioneer Zephyr for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. This self-propelled streamlined train set was sleek and modern and took full advantage of Budd's unique construction methods. This train set also added the railroad industry to Budd's long list of endeavors. Over the coming years, Budd improved upon their Zephyr train set with several innovations, most notably the addition of disc brakes in 1938. Budd also further entered the railroad industry with their creation of lightweight passenger cars that were more appealing to the railroads as they were just as durable but considerably lighter than the heavyweight cars they were used to. Budd tried to create more diesel multiple units for railroads, as they had even greater operational flexibility than their streamliner train sets offered. Other railcar manufacturers were also seeing the success this market had to offer, but all of them exited shortly after the start of the Great Depression. In 1932, Budd created another self-powered vehicle for the Pennsylvania Railroad and Reading Company. Budd partnered with French company Michelin to acquire rubber tires for their vehicles. Mechanically, these vehicles were reliable, with all their problems coming from their Michelin rubber tires, which suffered from frequent blowouts and caused derailments. Then Budd tried again, this time using traditional steel wheels, and in 1941, they created the Prospector diesel multiple unit for the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. The Prospector was a two-car diesel multiple unit that had both coach and sleeping car accommodations. This design was popular with the public and crews, but the cars suffered mechanical failures and were retired in 1942. So far, the only successful and reliable self-propelled vehicles Budd has been able to produce were the streamliner train sets. But with World War II starting, Budd had to redirect their railcar resources to creating truck bodies and wheels for the US military. When the war ended, Budd went back to producing passenger cars, just as they always had. However, their streamliners were falling out of fashion. Although these vehicles were still modern and very fast, they were also not what railroads wanted anymore. With passenger numbers dwindling and track conditions deteriorating, the railroads did not want comfort, they wanted cost cuts, and they did not want speed, they wanted cost cuts. As speed and comfort were the main selling points of Budd streamliners, the company knew that something new was needed. Budd took advantage of all the technical progress made during the war when designing this new diesel-powered railcar. Budd took advantage of new high-powered Detroit diesel engines that powered several tanks during the war, as well as hydraulic torque converter transmissions, which were taken from an M46 patent tank. The result of this design process was the first in the series of Budd RDCs, the RDC-1, which was unveiled to the public on September 19, 1949 at Chicago's Union Station. The stainless steel look that had been prevalent on all previous Budd rail equipment again made an appearance on the RDC with the ribbed stainless steel sides. The RDC's air conditioning and comfort on the increasingly rough tracks impressed the public. The flexibility that this unit offered, with its ability to be operated independently or coupled to multiple RDCs to form a train, impressed railroads and crews. Its cheap operating costs compared to locomotive-hauled coaches, and even Budd's previous streamliner, made them perfect for the increasingly ignored routes of most railroads, since, at the time, railroads had to operate passenger services over every line they operated. The Budd RDC was priced at $127,000 to $130,000, and cost about half of what a traditional locomotive-hauled train would cost to operate. The Budd RDC was perfect for the time. Each RDC had two Detroit diesel 6-cylinder 110 series engines, each with 275 horsepower for a combined total of 550 horsepower per car. Each engine drove a single axle through a hydraulic torque converter transmission. Even though the RDC had 2 trucks of 4 wheels each, only 2 wheels and a single axle was powered on each truck, giving the RDC a wheel arrangement of 1A-A1, the 1 meaning an unpowered axle and the A meaning a powered one. As the RDC had 2 separate engine and drivetrain systems, one could completely fail, and the other could power the RDC for the remainder of the trip until it could be repaired. This increased the reliability and flexibility of these units. Each engine and transmission were mounted on rails, that way each could be swapped out and repaired or replaced easily. The engines were liquid-cooled by radiators, mounted in a raised section of the roof, and connected with pipes and pumps to the engines and water tanks which were mounted under the floor. The exhaust was also roof-mounted, allowing exhaust gases to be directed away from passengers when stopping at stations. However, this also resulted in the gases being sucked in by the air conditioning on trailing RDCs. The RDC-1 had operating controls at each end, allowing for easy bidirectional operation. In each cab on either side were doors, giving 2 doors per side and 4 per car. Each door was designed for low-level platforms, with steps down that could be covered with a trapdoor to be able to use the control stand and close the door. Each cab also contained 2 flip-down seats to allow operators to sit down and allow access to the doors when the seats were not in use. Leading from each cab, there was a door on the front or back of the RDC that could give access to adjacent RDCs in front or behind while the train was in motion. At each end of the car, there was also a restroom. In the RDC-1, one was designated for males and the other was designated for females. With the engines and water tanks mounted under the floor and radiators, fans, and exhausts mounted on the roof, there was no intrusion of components into the passenger compartment, leaving it just as open for seats as normal unpowered equipment. This increased public favorability of the model. With Budd's shot welding stainless steel construction techniques that allowed the RDC to be much lighter than other DMUs, as they weighed anywhere from 109,200 pounds to 118,300 pounds, depending upon the variant. This lightweight, combined with the high power from the tank-derived twin Detroit diesel engines, gave the RDC a high power-to-weight ratio, and therefore made it accelerate quickly and much faster than other equipment. On level track, the RDC could hit 45 miles per hour in 60 seconds and 80 miles per hour in just under 4 minutes, and they would go on to hit a top speed of 83 miles per hour. Using disc brakes that Budd had pioneered on their earlier Streamliner equipment, the RDC could decelerate at 2.8 miles per second. The first demonstrator unit toured the country, gathering interest and orders from several railroads. It started service on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and they were impressed with the model very much. With orders coming in, Budd started their production run that would start in 1949 and last until 1962, spanning 13 years. Over those 13 years, the design had remained mostly the same, with a few updates added on over time. The first 10 RDCs produced had a slightly different rooftop radiator housings than later RDCs built, and these are referred to as Phase 1A RDCs. The Phase 1B RDCs had multiple grills covering the radiators. This was eventually changed to become a single piece, changing the designation of these RDCs to Phase 1C. All Phase 1 RDCs rode on fabricated trucks called Pioneer trucks. They were called this as the trucks were similar to those used on the Pennsylvania Railroad's Pioneer electric multiple units, also built by Budd. The biggest change to the RDC design came in 1956, when the Phase 2 RDC was introduced. The engines on the Phase 2 RDCs were upgraded to 280 horsepower, giving them 5 horsepower more each. The stainless steel ribbing continued onto the front of the RDC, and the cab windows were made smaller to allow number boards to be positioned above them. The headlights were relocated to above the roofline. This allowed diaphragms to be added to allow passengers to walk between cars safely. Also, the radiator housing was updated again. All Phase 2 RDCs still rode on Pioneer-style trucks, except now they were cast rather than fabricated. It can be hard to tell the different phases of RDCs apart, as the differences were not that noticeable, and many RDCs were rebuilt with sometimes parts from all 4 phases by the railroads that eventually would own them. At the request of several railroads, Budd created further variants of the RDC that offered greater flexibility to those same railroads. The first variant was the RDC-1, which was the first and most numerous version ordered by far. This version was 85 feet long and could accommodate 90 passengers and had 2 restrooms and a control cab on each end. The RDC-2 was created, and it contained a 17-foot baggage section, and in that section a 4-foot wide door was added to load baggage on each side. The rest of the RDC was dedicated to seating the 70 passengers. The RDC had 1 restroom and had control cabs on each end and a combined length of 85 feet. The RDC-3 had a 17-foot railway post office on one end, with a coach section with a capacity of 70 passengers on the other. Each end of the RDC had a control cab and a restroom for a combined length of 85 feet. The RDC-4 had a 30-foot railway post office and a 31-foot baggage section, and contained no seating for passengers. Because of this, it had no air conditioning, but it still had a toilet and a cab at each end. As the weight of mail and baggage would make this version considerably heavier than other RDCs when loaded, and thus slower, the car has a length of 73 feet 10 inches, compared to the 85-foot length of other variants. This was done to save weight and help it match the performance of other variants. The RDC-9 was created in 1956 for the Boston and Maine Railroad as a powered trailer. It contained no cabs, but 2 restrooms just like the RDC-1. It was 85 feet long and could seat 94 passengers, 4 more than the RDC-1. Even though the RDC-9 had no cabs, it still had a single 280 horsepower engine that was able to be controlled by another RDC. The Boston and Maine used them to make 3-car train sets of RDCs, with an RDC of another variant on each end of an RDC-9. Also in 1956, the New Haven Railroad approached Budd as they wanted to purchase a train set based on the RDC design. The train set was made up of 6 cars, 2 custom-built cars with unique nose similar in style to the cab of a Fairbanks Morse P-12-42 diesel locomotive, with 4 RDC-9s in the middle of the set. In addition to custom cabs, the New Haven Railroad also requested that the set be fitted with third-rail shoes, traction motors, and all the necessary electrical equipment to allow for third-rail operation into Grand Central with its diesel engine switched off. The set still retained its diesel engines for operation on unelectrified lines, making this a multiple-unit dual mode. This train set was called the Roger Williams. The set was operated as intended for a little while, but the New Haven Railroad was not interested in further orders, as the EMD FL9 and coaches proved much more reliable for the dual-mode job. The Roger Williams was eventually split up and used with other RDCs in the New Haven Railroad's large fleet. As time went on, railway post offices and baggage services were discontinued on several routes. Rather than have the RDCs that contain these features be withdrawn, many railroads chose to rebuild and modify them to be more like RDC-1s. Some railroads designated them as RDC-1s, but some also chose to use the RDC-5 designation. At the end of the RDC's production, Budd had constructed 398 RDCs of all variants. This number does not include any built under license or special orders such as the Roger Williams. The RDC was globally purchased, with the bulk of the units produced going to the US and Canada, but they were also operated, and some still operate, in Brazil, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, and Australia, with some similar models operating in Taiwan. In the US alone, 24 railroads purchased the RDC new from Budd, with even more purchasing them used from those original 24 operators. Metro-North received their RDCs from both the New Haven Railroad and the New York Central Railroad. The New Haven Railroad purchased 40 RDCs from Budd, in addition to the 6 that made up the Roger Williams train set. In 1955, RDCs were used on 65% of the railroad's passenger service. The railroad advertised the RDCs as shoreliners, as they were used to supplement services on the railroad's main line, nicknamed the Shoreline, as it followed the shore of the Long Island Sound up the coast of Connecticut. The railroad was in possession of 29 RDC-1s, 2 RDC-2s, 6 RDC-3s, and 4 RDC-4s, in addition to the 2 custom RDCs and 4 RDC-9s that made up the Roger Williams train set. The New York Central Railroad also had an extensive fleet of RDCs, with a total of 20. They had 16 RDC-1s, 1 RDC-2, and 3 RDC-3s, the most famous of which would be number M497, an RDC-3, which was modified with a streamlined nose and 2 5,000 horsepower GE J47-19 jet engines recovered from a Convair B-36. Between Butler, Indiana and Streaker, Ohio, it reached 184 miles per hour, which at the time was the land speed record and the fastest train has ever gone in the United States. In the 1960s, it was not uncommon to have an RDC on a train of electric multiple units into Grand Central. The engine would be shut down and the electric units would provide the power to move, and the batteries in the RDC would be able to provide light to the passengers. However, the cars had no heat or air conditioning, but the train was able to operate into Grand Central. The New Haven, New York Central, and Pennsylvania railroads merged to form Penn Central in 1968. All of the RDCs owned by the railroads at that point became property of Penn Central. Most of the New York Central's RDCs had Penn Central stickers placed over the New York Central logos. The New Haven RDCs were repainted into New York Central colors, just with Penn Central stickers rather than New York Central ones. When Amtrak took over passenger service, they took some RDCs from the railroads that they were taking over service from. They had one RDC-2 from the New York Central Railroad, and from the New Haven Railroad, Amtrak acquired 10 RDC-1s and 4 RDC-2s. Amtrak also acquired 3 RDC-1s and 3 RDC-2s from the Burlington Northern and its predecessors. Amtrak also acquired the 2 cab ends of the Roger Williams train set. The 4 trailers ended up being acquired by the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. Amtrak's total came to 23, which they used in service on the Springfield line between New Haven, Connecticut and Springfield, Massachusetts. Amtrak repainted them during the years they had them and added diaphragms between cars and retired them in 1985. Some of Amtrak's RDCs wound up in museum service, with the 2 cab ends of the Roger Williams train set and 1 middle coach being preserved in New Haven paint at the Danbury Railway Museum. After Penn Central filed for bankruptcy and Amtrak had taken over their intercity services, the company carried on for a few years providing freight and commuter service, but ultimately the company would fail and end up being dissolved into Conrail, including Penn Central's commuter service and its passenger equipment such as their RDCs. Although this service was operated by Conrail, it was sponsored by the governments of the respective areas where the services were run. This meant that all passenger equipment owned by Conrail was assigned to various agencies, sold, or scrapped. The case with the RDCs was no different. Some of the ex-New Haven RDCs were put into service on the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Agency's commuter routes, with some also being taken by Metro-North. Some of the ex-New York Central RDCs were transferred to Metro-North service as well. Metro-North only took RDC-1s from either railroad, but I do not know exactly how many, but I have seen pictures of 17, and if none were scrapped, they could have up to 28. Metro-North used these RDCs to run shuttle trains on their unelectrified branch lines, with them seeing service on the Danbury and Waterbury branches. At the time of Metro-North's formation, the electrification on the Harlem line stopped at North White Plains. The increasingly frequent service was operated almost exclusively by Budd RDCs on this section of track, with the exception of a few express trains. Budd RDCs also operated shuttles up to Dover Plains, also on the Harlem line. On Metro-North's west of Hudson lines, Budd RDCs made up the bulk of west of Hudson service. Prior to the pooling of Metro-North and New Jersey Transit equipment for use on those lines, they were the only equipment Metro-North had to operate them, with the exception of a single Metro-North-owned U-34CH and coach set. Metro-North was keeping their RDCs running. Typically, the engines and transmissions would be replaced once a year, and in that year they would be mostly maintenance-free, with the exception of oil constantly needing to be added. Metro-North kept the original engines, but switched out the transmissions for standard Alstom ones, as the hydraulic transmissions were becoming hard to find. Metro-North sent some of their RDCs for rebuilds at Chrome Crankshaft in Silvis, Illinois. Those rebuilds gave the RDCs new life and allowed Metro-North to run them for even longer. With the RDCs having reached their 40th birthday, Metro-North was running out of uses for them, with the Harlem line having electrification extended from North White Plains to just north of Brewster in Southeast in 1984. The RDCs became of no use on this section of track. Metro-North did not have a use for many of the RDCs they rostered. The railroad tried to replace them with a newer-built diesel railcar, the SPV 2000, but this was a failure. I will discuss the SPV 2000 in a future episode of Engines of Metro-North. Then Metro-North looked to a traditional locomotive and coach combination for its shuttle services. The railroad purchased 4 ex-Massachusetts Bay Transportation Agency EMD FB10 locomotives in 1990, and shortly thereafter the RDCs were retired. In west of Hudson service, the RDCs lasted slightly longer. Metro-North was looking to add flexibility and reliability to its west of Hudson lines by combining and pooling service with New Jersey Transit. In order to avoid a costly retraining of New Jersey Transit engineers on the RDCs that railroad had already retired some time ago, it was decided that it was a good time to replace them. Metro-North ordered 6 GP40 FH-2 locomotives alongside New Jersey Transit in 1991 and withdrew all RDCs from service that same year. In 1944, the New York and Susquehanna Railroad was preparing to operate commuter service into Syracuse, New York. as a provision in their deal to purchase the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. This new commuter service was to be run by the New York and Susquehanna Railroad, but being a freight railroad, they were not in possession of any coaches, nor were they in possession of any locomotives to provide head and power to the coaches. The railroad looked to Metro-North's fleet of out-of-service RDCs, as they had recently been rebuilt, and purchased 4 units, and operated them up until on-track's conclusion in 2007. Other railroads were also retiring their RDCs around the same time, as the mechanical systems had become vastly outdated. But the indestructible Budd car bodies and trucks still had several years of life left in them. The MBTA sent most of their RDCs to Morrison Knudsen in Boise, Idaho, to be converted into non-powered coaches and cab cars. These cars were nicknamed Boise Budds, due to the city that they were converted in. Metro-North needed more coaches to support service increases, and in 1990, they purchased 16 Boise Budd cars from the Virginia Railway Express that had previously purchased the cars from the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, but did not have a need for them. Metro-North painted the cars in a version of the Metro-North paint scheme, and used them mainly on the Upper Harlem Line shuttles. Metro-North replaced the Boise Budds with Shoreliner 4s in 1998. The cars were then sold to Caltrain, and they are now in service on the Grand Canyon Railway. Metro-North started to dispose of their RDCs, but 3 owned by Metro-North and many owned by other railroads were ultimately preserved. Metro-North 47 and 32 are at the Danbury Railway Museum, with 47 having been stripped for parts to keep 32 running. 1 unit having served for Metro-North and on-track is preserved at the Conway Scenic Railroad, still wearing a scheme of its on-track paint. And Metro-North 41 is operating at the Railroad Museum of New England, although it is currently out on lease to another railroad. Even though several RDCs have been designated as museum pieces for several years, a few remain in passenger service around the world. The most notable company to still use them is Via Rail, which still rosters 8 of them and uses them almost exclusively on the Sudbury to White River line. They currently roster 3 RDC-1s and 5 RDC-2s. In 2006, TriMet, the transportation agency for Portland, Oregon, wanted to start a commuter service named the West Side Express. The agency wanted to use DMUs for this commuter service, and purchased the only DMU that was authorized to operate in the United States from Colorado Railcar. But Colorado Railcar filed for bankruptcy before the cars were delivered. This cost TriMet money, and they did not receive the number of cars they originally wanted. To make up for this, in 2009 the agency purchased 2 RDCs from the Alaska Railroad and refurbished and repainted them. The cars entered service in 2011, but more cars were still needed. So in 2017, the agency purchased 2 more RDCs from All Earth Rail. The cars are currently being refurbished and repainted and should be ready for service in 2021. A car that was designed in 1949 by a company that made durable car bodies with drivetrain components from a Korean War tank ended up lasting in service for 60 years, and possibly even more. With the RDC, Budd had a winning formula for the time and the direction that railroad service would take for the next 60 years. The durable bodies, the reliable fail-safe drivetrain system, and the cheap operating costs made the RDC a success for Budd and passenger railroads across North America. Oftentimes, RDCs were the only passenger trains operating in most parts of the country. The RDCs lived on in commuter service, which Budd had never even designed them for, but they were perfect for it. Producing their famous smoke shows and burning their weight in oil, the RDCs live on. The RDC was so good that not even the people that made it can make it again, and nor can anybody else. And that is all about the Budd RDC. This is by far the most in-depth and probably the longest video that I've ever made. So if you like it, give it a like, and if you loved it, please do subscribe. If you dislike it, you can do that too, and please leave a comment for anything else. And with that said, thanks for watching, and goodbye.